This is a session involving academic freedom and highly provocative speech. This is Anne Franke, and I'm Barbara Lee, and we're glad to see so many people are either very interested or very worried about academic freedom and highly provocative speech. So I'm going to give you a little bit of guideline on what we're going to be doing. I'm going to start by talking about the faculty issue, and Anne will talk about students. We have put together a couple of very short hypotheticals to get you folks involved, one on faculty and one on students. And then we promise to leave plenty of time for questions and answers. So that's the roadmap for what we're going to do today. Do you want me to read the hypos or just go ahead and go?
Well, we thought we would start out by sharing our short scenarios, our hypotheticals with you. And our slides were a little slow in the arrival, a little slow in their creation, and then a little slow in their arrival. So Barbara, why don't I read the first one,
okay,
which is short, and then you can read the second one, and oh, we're here.
All we need to do is advance the slide by one.
All right. Perfect.
Right,
great timing. Thank you. So this is our
I just said that.
Right. And there you go. All right, I'll read the artful assignment, even though it's Barbara's territory, which is faculty provocative speech. So we have Professor Artful, who teaches an introductory, call it studio art class. For a midterm assignment, the students must create a collage inspired by the 2013 federal government shutdown. Each student must incorporate into his or her collage a swatch of fabric from an actual American flag. Professor Artful has kindly distributed flag swatches to everyone. And uproar ensues. The local newspaper, known as The Patriot, is calling for Professor Artful's immediate dismissal.
Thank you. We're talking about these now because we want to give you time as we work through our very short presentations to think about the hypotheticals, and then we'll come back to them, and then you'll have all the answers for us. The second one is called Impertinent Pat. This is a student hypothetical. She's enrolled in an online women's studies course, and Pat finds the comments that everyone else posts on the class discussion board to be an utter waste of time. Pat posts a comment that the other students should pull up your socks, do your reading, stop whining, and grow up. Pat adds that the professor is close to worthless and could use a good swat on the old Beano. Pat's assignments and other class postings have been very good. Still, the professor is considering whether to punish Pat by awarding 0 points out of a possible 20 for class participation during the semester. And if these sound familiar to you, they probably are. They certainly are to me. So I'm going to start talking a bit about faculty provocative speech, but before that, I want to just make a couple of comments about academic freedom. I think academic freedom is widely understood. Professors think it allows them to do anything they wish. That's not true. I think sometimes administrators feel that academic freedom is fairly narrowly confined. I'm not sure that's true either. The truth is someplace in the middle, and as you might expect, the courts are all over the place on this topic. But both faculty and students have academic freedom, and I think it's important to remember that students have it as well as faculty, and we need to remind our faculty of that from time to time. Most colleges and universities take as a given that both faculty and students have academic freedom. But when provocative speech upsets students, or the administration, particularly if you're criticizing the president or the trustees or the provost, or community members, and there's litigation involving all of those constituencies, then how much protection does academic freedom provide? We're going to talk about a number of cases where faculty or students claimed academic freedom protections for speech that was considered provocative. Now, this issue is a hot one. It's almost impossible to open the Chronicle of Higher Education or Inside Higher Ed in the morning when I take a look at it every week, it seems, all semester and before, some faculty member, sometimes an adjunct, but sometimes somebody with tenure, and by the way, academic freedom applies to all faculty, whether they have tenure or not. It's just harder for an untenured faculty member or an adjunct to succeed in an academic freedom claim, in my opinion.
Or finance an academic freedom claim.
Or finance a claim. But theoretically, anyone teaching in an American college or university that has adopted an academic freedom policy is protected by that policy. Examples of issues, well, I have a number that I want to go over with you in a minute, but what is academic freedom? Is it the same as First Amendment free speech? No, it's not, because academic freedom covers faculty at both public and private universities, and of course the First Amendment does not protect faculty at private universities, because the First Amendment free speech provisions talk about the government's limitations in terms of regulating speech. Academic freedom is not mentioned at all in the U.S. Constitution. So despite the fact that occasionally the U.S. Supreme Court has used First Amendment language to talk about academic freedom protections, they are not one and the same. Academic freedom protections are often contained in policy statements and faculty handbooks, and accrediting associations require these sorts of statements in order for an institution to get regional accreditation. So academic freedom is at least a matter of contract at colleges and universities where academic freedom protections have been adopted, and may or may not be related to the First Amendment at public institutions. Many of you are probably familiar with the American Association of University Professors' 1940 Statement on Academic Freedom and Tenure. Many institutions have adopted that as policy. Again, that would be a contractual issue, very likely. Maybe they've adopted it in a collective bargaining agreement with their faculty union. Again, that would be a contractual issue. But there are limits to academic freedom. This, for example, if you're talking about classroom speech, which many of these examples that we've been reading about in the press have been classroom speech, the speech has to be germane, relevant to the subject matter of the course. The faculty member must be respectful, the AAUP policy says, of the opinions of others. And the statement also explains that academic freedom does not permit harassment of either students or other colleagues. So there are limits to academic freedom, the professional limits and also legal limits. Let me give you some examples of what's been going on in the clash between academic freedom and provocative speech. At the U.S. Naval Academy, all right, which it never occurred to me to wonder if the faculty there had academic freedom or not, but apparently they do. A tenured professor of English who criticized affirmative action, which the Naval Academy practices, was denied a merit pay increase at least he alleged that that was the reason for the denial. And he was all ready to sue, and the Naval Academy settled that conflict with him. A tenured professor at Northeastern Illinois University claimed potential retaliation when she complained and urged her students to protest the presence of military recruiters on campus. Does this sound like the 60s to you? It certainly sounds familiar to me. Just last month, a state appellate court said she could sue the university for defamation because of the way she was treated. And I suspect you read about the instructor at Florida Atlantic University who was teaching an intercultural communication course. And it's not clear to me whether what I'm saying now, which I pulled from the press, is completely accurate. So if there's anybody here from Florida Atlantic University who wants to set me straight, that's fine. The story said that he was placed on administrative leave after a student complained about a classroom exercise that involved stepping on a picture of Jesus. Now, whether or not that's precisely how it came down, I don't know. But that's the way the press reported it. So all of this is going on, particularly in public institutions, in an environment where the U.S. Supreme Court has sharply limited the First Amendment free speech rights of anyone who works for a public organization, including faculty at public colleges and universities. And the case is called Garcetti. It's cited in the paper that Ann and I wrote that's in your materials. It was decided in 2006. And the case said, it was a 5-4 opinion, 5-4, which many of them are these days. And the court said that any public employee, anyone working for a public organization, if they are engaging in speech that's related to their work responsibilities, that speech is not protected by the First Amendment, which causes a real problem for faculty at public institutions who, of course, are required to speak as part of their teaching and their research obligations, not to mention their governance obligations as well. So the courts have been somewhat inconsistent about whether or not they believe that the Garcetti precedent covers teaching and research in public institutions of higher education. We cite 3 cases in your materials, one called Hong versus Grant, where a professor was denied a merit pay increase. The institution said it was because he didn't do very much research. He said it was because he had criticized the way that the search committee and hiring committee was operating. The court said, Garcetti, I think we have a new verb. You get Garcetti'd now. It's a little like getting borked if you want to be a Supreme Court justice. Now you get Garcetti'd if you are disciplined or fired for speech that's related to your work. A second case, this is one of my favorites actually, Gorham versus Sessoms. This was a professor who changed the grades of 64 students without telling their professors. And many of these students had not gone to class or had incomplete grades or had not done the work. But Professor Gorham apparently was trying to help them, and so he changed their grades from incompletes or Fs to As. Maybe it was around the end of the year holidays, I don't know. Anyway, the institution fired him. He claimed that it was because he had criticized the president. The institution said it was because he changed the grades. And the court said, well, your speech was in the role of governance, and that is, you've just been Garcetti'd. So he lost his free speech claim. A third case, Rankin versus Gregory, a faculty member got a research grant, disagreed with the dean on how the grant was to be spent, had some fairly strong disagreements with that dean and another one. So the grant was sent back because they couldn't agree on how the money would be spent. He filed a lawsuit, and he lost because the court said getting a research grant is part of your teaching responsibilities. You've just been Garcetti'd. So that case is concerning. Now, there's some opposite trends that I'll talk about in a minute, but let me move on at the moment to matters of public concern. So the analysis with provocative speech for faculty is this. Number one, is it speech related to your work? If it is, no protection. You've been Garcetti'd. The second question is, if the speech is not related to your work, not work-related, but is a matter of public concern, then it goes back to the old Pickering case, which we also cite in our paper. And then the court conducts a balancing test. The employee's right to free speech compared with or balanced with the employer's concern for maintaining order and discipline. Would the speech be disruptive? Would it create difficulties in running the operation of the university? So this combination of Garcetti then and the old version of the Pickering case leads to a strange conclusion. We're all using examples today of dealing with the government shutdown. I guess that's very much on people's minds. So let's take a professor of political science who criticizes Congress. It doesn't matter which political party, all of them, okay? And if the political science professor talks about Congress and it's germane to the subject of political science that he or she is teaching, it would be protected by academic freedom, but it would not be protected under Garcetti. So how do you like that outcome? It means that if Garcetti is applied strictly to classroom speech, germane classroom speech would not be protected by the First Amendment, but it would be protected by academic freedom because it's germane to the subject. If a chemistry professor criticizes Congress, under academic freedom, that's not protected because it's not germane to chemistry, unless he's talking about funding the National Science Foundation, okay? Under Garcetti, it would be, because it's not work-related speech. He's not talking about chemistry. So it's absolutely nuts. Absolutely nuts. Technical legal term, nuts. So some lower courts are understandably concerned about this issue, and they're creating what they're calling an academic exception to Garcetti, and we talk about that in our paper as well. There are several cases, one from the Fourth Circuit, another from the Seventh Circuit, that have said that if you're dealing with teaching or research, we don't think Garcetti should apply because there was some very wishy-washy language in the Garcetti opinion, which again we've duplicated in the paper, that says, well, from the Supreme Court, we're not going to talk about teaching and research. We're going to leave that for another day. So what does that mean? It means that maybe someday they will take this up, we hope, in a case, or maybe we hope not, actually. If the lower courts are basically ignoring Garcetti when the issue is teaching or scholarship, then the First Amendment and academic freedom will be coterminous, and we won't have this conflict that we seem to have right now. So let's talk then about limits on provocative speech. The paper gives some examples of sexual harassment cases, which I won't get into now, where the courts decided that paper topics in an English class that had sexual themes were germane, were relevant to the subject matter that the professor was teaching, and the sexual harassment policy was too vague to allow the faculty member to understand what kind of behavior would be punished. And so they ruled that the faculty member's speech was protected under the First Amendment. There's another case that I think is extremely interesting and probably important for all of us to think about, and that's the Rodriguez versus Maricopa County Community College case, where a professor circulated very nasty, hateful emails criticizing Latinos, and a number of Latino employees sued the college because the college didn't punish the professor. The employees said that the professor was creating, and the college was creating, a hostile work environment for them by allowing these emails to go out without punishment. Well, the college did respond to the emails. The president responded with a very strongly worded statement disapproving of the ideas expressed in the emails. And he also said that we are an academic institution, and even though I personally despise what this individual said in these emails, I think that the academic freedom of the institution is more important than disciplining the individual, and I don't believe it's appropriate to do that. And these employees sued, and they lost. The court agreed. The court said the college has its own academic freedom to respond in the way that it feels is appropriate to this hateful speech. So in this case, the hateful speech generated more speech, and the community then became engaged in a discussion about this provocative speech, of which I'm guessing virtually everyone disapproved. So we have some unresolved issues with respect to faculty provocative speech. It's not clear about governance, faculty speech related to governance. It's not clear whether this academic exception that some of the federal appellate courts have created would apply to governance as opposed to classroom speech or speech related to scholarship. Personnel decisions. If during the course of a personnel decision, a faculty meeting, a department meeting where personnel decisions are being discussed, if something is said that is offensive to someone or that creates an opportunity perhaps for discipline, is that a Garcetti occasion, or is that protected? Some institutions have incorporated academic freedom protections into their faculty handbooks, or in some cases into their faculty collective bargaining agreements. And that is a way that some institutions, I know the University of Delaware has done that, for example. So if you want to grab Larry White, you can talk to him about how that came about and what his role was in it and what the outcome has been. Bottom line, this is up in the air right now. I think the number of occasions that we have seen, and again, the most recent one was the 10th of October, that was 4 days ago, where a faculty member was criticized for saying something to her students that indicated her political preferences. And there was a pretty strong backlash, and she was required to apologize for doing that. Everyone seems to be very sensitive these days to what faculty members say in the classroom, outside of the classroom, to the press, or maybe when they think they're speaking privately on their Facebook page. Ha, ha, ha. So it's a tough time for academic freedom. I'm certainly not suggesting that this is a McCarthy era. I'm not saying that. But I do think that there are a lot of questions about what faculty members can be permitted to say and what the institution's response should be.
And, I saw a hand go up. Was that a clarification of something that Barbara was saying? And
They have been.
And just to repeat the question for the recording, the question was whether the academic freedom protections can be enforced as a contractual matter.
Yes, they can.
Yes. All right. I will take you briefly through the terrain of student provocative speech. And if you think that faculty members are creative in their provocative speech, you ain't seen nothing yet. In fact, at the beginning of our paper, we included a little disclaimer saying, readers, please be aware that there will be provocative speech in this paper, and most of it's in the description of the cases involving student speech. Barbara mentioned academic freedom as an accreditation requirement, and I've seen some accreditors that overly expand the concept to include not only students and faculty, but also administrators and staff as protected by academic freedom, which I think is a perversion, really, of the concept. I'm going to be talking about student academic freedom, not student free speech rights generally. Much of the discussion over the past decade in the area of student speech has addressed student activities, student organizations, tabling disputes in the residential halls. So I'm leaving all of that aside and looking at student speech that is either in the classroom or connected to classroom activities, some of the Facebook postings about things that have happened in class. So I'm setting aside a big swath of what is commonly covered in student expressional rights for the sake of looking at academic freedom interests. Now, college students do have academic freedom, but it's not unlimited, just as faculty speech rights are not limited, are limited, forgive me. I view college students as having greater rights than high school students in speaking their minds and lesser rights than faculty members in exploring controversial ideas, because we're holding students accountable for learning and for the learning environment as well. And so those are factors that courts often look to as they resolve student academic freedom disputes. One of the touchstone Supreme Court cases was in 1969. It's called Tinker versus Des Moines Area School District, and it's cited in our paper. Mary Beth Tinker and I believe her brother were from a family that was against the Vietnam War. These two students wore to their school, I forget the level of schooling, but they wore black armbands in protest of the war. They did not engage in advocacy per se, but this other than wearing black armbands. The school found the armbands sufficiently disruptive that they excluded the children from the school if they were going to be so attired. The Supreme Court vindicated the rights of the students in a case that balanced the students' interest in expression against the school's interest in avoiding disruption. And frankly, the Supreme Court was quite unpersuaded that wearing a black armband was so disruptive to the educational environment that these students must be excluded. Interestingly, even today, Mary Beth Tinker is still active in promoting student rights, so it's quite inspiring when I occasionally see her speaking on a program. So we have the university as the marketplace of ideas. I believe our opening plenary session was making that point at several times. The question from the student standpoint is, what is my role in this marketplace of ideas? What freedom do I have to sell my own ideas? And the first topic I cover in the student section of our paper is this one of speech in class and in written assignments. Somewhat like Mary Beth Tinker and her brother, there were some students around the country recently who were engaging in a protest involving wearing empty holsters to class. They were supporting carrying weapons on campus, and as a show of their support, were wearing empty holsters. Now, around the country, schools took varying approaches, had dramatically different reactions to this. Some schools said, free speech, First Amendment, not disruptive. One school in Texas, however, banned students from wearing empty holsters in support of their political position. And like the outcome in Tinker, this somewhat provocative action was deemed not to create a disruption. It was simply a fact of their attire in their classes. The court drew a distinction between leafleting in a class or leafleting in the hallway outside of a class, perhaps as your classmates are coming in, and simply wearing in the class a holster showing your position on a current political issue. So that's one example that flows straight out of Tinker. We have another case involving a class on public speaking, where students in the class were expected to give talks on various topics of their own choice, and their classmates, along with the professor, would critique the delivery. One student, college student, sought to give a talk on abortion and the death penalty. The professor, however, prevented the student from giving that talk, saying, you can speak on any subject you want except abortion, because if you were to discuss abortion, the classroom conversation would deteriorate into the politics of abortion, and it would submerge the real goal of the classroom to see how you deliver a speech. So this is the one topic that's off limits. And there the court sided with the professor, saying this is a reasonable pedagogical rule. It is tied in to potential disruption in the classroom. Now, I digress just briefly to bring you a post-Tinker Supreme Court decision from the high school level called Hazelwood, Unified School District versus Kuhlmeyer. Hazelwood was a high school case involving a student newspaper and the extent to which the principal of a high school could regulate a student newspaper. So here we have very clearly a high school context. And the content of expression really quite directly with school affairs. There, the Supreme Court created a test that's not a balancing test of, well, what were the students trying to do versus what was the school or the teacher trying to do. Rather, the Supreme Court said, if the school can articulate a legitimate pedagogical purpose, then the school wins. Now, should that or does that concept apply in the higher education setting where students are adults? We are known as the marketplace of ideas. The courts of appeals around the country are divided on whether they will apply the Hazelwood standard to college cases that arise in their region. You know, the federal courts of appeals each covers a region around the country, and I think more of the courts of appeals now will apply Hazelwood to the college setting. So when faced with this dispute in the speech class over whether the student could give a speech on abortion, the court said the professor has articulated a legitimate pedagogical purpose. The exercise is about how you give a speech and not the politics of abortion. The professor had articulated a legitimate reason for prohibiting the student to speak on this one particular topic. So the courts differ, and advocacy groups differ on whether Hazelwood is appropriate in the higher education setting. Now, in the realm of social media, we have students who are blogging and posting on Facebook about their classroom experiences. When they start blogging about their anatomical dissection in their mortuary science class, the faculty becomes concerned, and the courts validated that concern. Amanda Beth Tatro and her Facebook poster in our materials had named her cadaver Bernie, and used Bernie, at least described Bernie, as a mechanism for venting her frustrations over various things. And so I'm going to take my mortuary science tools into my anatomy class, and Bernie's really going to feel how I feel today about thus and such. That was, in general, the character of her Facebook postings. The court upheld the restrictions, the discipline of Amanda Beth Tatro on the premise that she needed to learn professionalism. She needed to learn how to respect cadavers in pursuing her field of mortuary science. Now, similarly, there was a student in a criminal justice class, and if you have your paper in front of you, this is Harrell versus Southern Oregon University on page 21. And Mr. Harrell was enrolled in Theories of Criminal Behavior, which was an online course. He made some rather controversial postings on the classroom discussion board and was counseled about those controversial postings. He then enrolled in a subsequent course, The Law of Criminal Procedure, and used the classroom discussion board, the online discussion board, to complain about his classmates, saying, clearly you haven't bothered to read the posts on this topic. You clearly haven't bothered to do the course reading. Feel free to post some, if you have anything substantive to contribute despite your lack of doing the reading, be my guest. The professor took Harrell to task privately, not in the discussion board, as shredding the course's esprit de corps and belittling his fellow students for failing to do the work. Here, Mr. Harrell challenged his discipline in the course, and the course upheld the professor's regulation of his classroom speech. But this is not talk radio, the court said. He was not admonished for expressing an unpopular view, but rather was making ad hominem attacks upon his classmates. He remains free to express his thoughts. He has simply been asked to do so in a mature manner. Now, that is a case that to me might come out a different way before a different judge without a Hazelwood standard being applied. So I simply park that thought in your mind for our subsequent discussion of one of our scenarios for you. Now, another category of speech is compelled speech relating to coursework, and I'll go relatively quickly through this. There are sometimes students who, for religious or other reasons, refuse to participate in a classroom assignment or refuse to pursue certain courses of clinical treatment that may be professionally appropriate. There are two cases involving counseling students who declined for various reasons to counsel clients who presented as homosexual. They had religious objections to this. They took slightly different paths to effectuating their objections, and the courts came out in slightly different ways in the two cases, looking in both circumstances to the ethics of the profession. There was also a theater student who was a Mormon who refused to recite play lines that involved certain kinds of obscenities or references to God. Her theater professor said, "This is a requirement of your instruction to become an actor." And this was an acting program, not a dramaturgy kind of program, that there are certain expectations we have for you. She prevailed in her action against the discipline that was imposed on her. Interestingly, she transferred to another school and successfully completed their acting program in a situation where they were more willing to make an accommodation. So we have students complaining about being compelled to speak what they consider to be provocative words. And then finally, we have student speech against faculty. I contrast this to faculty speech against administrators. Can a faculty member stand up in the faculty senate and say, "The dean is an ass"? Can a student stand up in the middle of a class and say, "The professor is an ass"? How do we as educational institutions deal with those circumstances? Are we taking an educational approach, a disciplinary approach to students? What is the context? The courts resolve these cases either under a Hazelwood standard where the institution mostly wins, or under a very context-specific example of what exactly was the student saying. So we've come to a place where students may end up having greater academic freedom rights than faculty, because in the public sector we have the Supreme Court applying the Garcetti standard to faculty speech. Students are not employees, and so they do not speak in the course of their employment. So except under the Hazelwood regimen in those circumstances, there may be circuits that would be more willing to tolerate provocative speech by a student than they would by a faculty member. And that contradicts the linear sequence I laid out for you of the college student lying somewhere between the high school student and the professor in terms of academic freedom interests. So there's a lot of context dependency here. On the other hand, there is Hazelwood coming down very strongly on the side of administrations. So Barbara,
Actually, could I just make one point? We agreed to interrupt each other if we were inspired. I don't know if I'm inspired, but I just wanted to add a comment. I've been reading a number of cases lately about students who are in pre-professional or professional training programs where they have codes of ethics or professional norms or other requirements that the academic program imposes on them, the academic program's specialized accrediting agency imposes on them, and the profession imposes on them, like medically related programs, for example. The counseling psychology cases that Anne was talking about are governed by the American Counseling Association's Code of Ethics, and that is also an accrediting agency that accredits these counseling programs. And the courts have been much less understanding of students who want to say whatever they want to, even if it violates these codes of ethics or these professional standards in those specified special kinds of academic programs. I think, so we seem to have a bifurcation. We have students who may just be in a regular liberal arts program or a science program or even a business program. And I think many judges look at them as, well, you know, you're just sort of feeling your oats, you're trying things out. We think college is not ought to be too heavy-handed in regulating the students. On the other hand, if they are in these fairly narrow professional preparation programs where they're going to have to behave themselves and act like grown-ups when they get their license, the courts give total deference just about to the institution. So I think we're seeing a split in the courts depending on the context in which the speech is being given, and these pre-professional programs perhaps are an exception to student academic freedom. Yes.
To that point, there are also rules of conduct that governs their behavior. So again, getting sort of the narrow practical basis upon which an institution may choose to discipline who violates their code of conduct or violating professional standards. I think that it's down not so much a free speech issue as whether they fail to adhere to standards that they agree to adhere to when they came into the program.
Oh, thank you. And just to repeat that, for the purpose of our remote audience, the comment addressed codes of conduct which may be in the expectations for students in pre-professional programs, and violating professional norms in those codes of conduct might be the basis of a contract enforcement, really, by the institution. I haven't captured that well, but Barbara, you can follow up.
Well, no, I think you're absolutely right. The Tatro case, the mortuary science case that Anne was speaking about, she was disciplined under the University of Minnesota's Student Code of Conduct, but they used the academic program's rules and regulations to justify the discipline. And the court said very clearly that if she had not been in this narrowly limited sort of academic program, the University of Minnesota would not be allowed to forbid her to blog because she has First Amendment free speech rights at a public institution. But that because she was blogging about an issue that was not permitted to be discussed under the Mortuary Science Code of Ethics, which frankly in my whole life I never thought I would be talking about the Mortuary Science Code of Ethics, and don't know much more about it than what the court opinion discussed. That is basically an exception, I think you could say, to her free speech rights because of this ethical and professional requirement. And frankly, there was another reason. The university was having trouble getting donated cadavers because they didn't want them mistreated the way this young woman had at least discussed doing. I'm not sure she actually ever did it. But she foolishly, in my opinion, released her Facebook postings to the local press so that everybody in the local community who might have been willing to donate Aunt Tilly to, the university's cadaver program now was quite concerned about what might happen to their loved one were a student let loose on it. So I think Anne is right that students' free speech rights are increasing unless you happen to be in a program where this ethical code and professional norms situation is paramount. And frankly, I think the courts have it right.
And just one additional piece of follow-up, implicit in the linkage is the profession's ethics applied to students and then applied in the classroom. That assumes that the profession's ethics are themselves respectful and an appropriate balance of free speech. So just as students have challenged speech codes of institutions, it's at least theoretically possible that a student could wind up challenging a constriction that is contained in a professional ethics code. That's quite far-fetched. I don't think it's going to happen. The courts are much more willing to assume that the morticians and the psychologists have balanced the interests appropriately and created suitable codes of conduct. So shall we return to the artful assignment?
Oh, we've got a question over here.
Good. Mm-hmm. It's in our paper on pages 29 and 30, and there the students, some nursing students, the questioner raised was trying to recall a case involving some students who posted on Facebook a picture of a placenta, and they were disciplined for doing that. It was 4 nursing students. There the court looked very carefully at the context and felt that the instructor had given implicit consent to the students who indicated that they were taking the photograph. The instructor was aware of it. They were sort of joking about putting the photograph on Facebook, and significantly, there was no breach of patient privacy. There was no indication of the origin of the organ. So in that case, the students prevailed, unlike the Tatro case, even though they were both in pre-professional curricula, because of the implicit assent of the instructor of the nursing students. So look at our paper, both those here and those of you out in the elsewhere in the country, our paper on pages 29 and 30. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, the comment speaks to the behavior of the nursing instructor, whether this was appropriate to implicitly consent to allow the students to do this. And I don't know the end of that story. There might have been some quiet discipline of that instructor. It certainly didn't make the news as far as I've seen, but that is an appropriate question. We have another hand up in the back of the room.
Okay, for the webinar, web streaming, excuse me, I'm going to try to consolidate what you said when you were far more articulate than I can be. The comment was that in schools of nursing, in her institution and elsewhere, the nursing instructors are very concerned about telling their students, not suggesting, but requiring that they be very careful in how they post on social media, because not only because of HIPAA, but because I think I'm right, that they want the students to focus on the needs of the patients, not their own needs. And it was interesting in this Tetro case, the mortuary science one. The young woman was using it as a therapeutic mechanism for herself, rather than being concerned about the dignity of the cadaver and maybe what the cadaver's family might feel about what she was saying. And that's a perfect segue to what you're just saying, that students look to social media to assuage their own concerns, and what you and your colleagues want nursing students to do is to think about the good of the patients, not the good of themselves. Fair enough? Okay.
Now, moving into the dignity of the flag, Barbara, shall we talk about our artful assignment? Please create a collage, use this swatch of the public flag, of the American flag in it. And all of a sudden, the Patriot newspaper is calling for Professor Artful's head. Do we have any reactions on this?
There's a...
So the comment is that there is no respect for other viewpoints in the requirement that the flag be incorporated. And I haven't been a law professor, but law professors like to push back. Let me just push back a little bit. I'm not telling you how you incorporate the flag. It's not that different from requiring you to do an oil painting, or I'm giving you some raw material with which you may express your own viewpoint. How does that grab, anybody buy that one? Yes, we have a comment back here.
The difference there is that you're taking an image that's held dear to others and forcing them to put it into an art project. Imagine if the same thing were to be to take the blood of a fetus who was aborted and put that into your project. Would that cause concern? And of course, it would in some cases. So it's that. It's not being told how to use it, it's just the flag material itself. And of course, the violation of the flag code disrespectful actions toward the flag.
And so
You're off.
the comment was that we hold the flag in respect in our country, and so this is creating disrespect for the flag, so there's an inherent problem with the assignment. Anybody care to take a different point of view?
I wondered about the legality, actually. It's been so long since I've seen anybody wrap themselves in a flag that I wasn't clear on whether it was illegal to do anything like cutting up a flag, and it's not. The recommendation is that a flag, when it's too old or not in good shape, to burn it respectfully and privately. But as far as I can tell, it's not illegal to actually cut up a flag in pieces and use it in an art project. Just wanted to clarify that.
We have a comment here.
You're absolutely right. The Supreme Court decided 5-4 that burning the flag is protected speech. Justice Scalia was the majority.
Right, so burning the flag is protected speech, and even Justice Scalia in a 5-4 decision agreed with that. Right, Justice Scalia agreed with that. And in the Vietnam War era, there was a lot of controversy over wearing a flag as a patch on the back of your blue jeans, or, that kind of displays of partial flags or defaced flags, and the Supreme Court has found a First Amendment protection for that kind of oppositional speech. We have a further comment in the back here.
By the same token, we mentioned the Mormon student in the drama class who didn't want to articulate particular vulgarities. I believe there was another example. In this case, what that teacher is doing is expecting the student to participate in the teacher's speech having to do with the destruction of that symbol, and is completely disregarding any belief of the student himself in requiring that student to take on the teacher's
The comment is that the professor may be requiring the student to endorse the professor's disrespect of the flag, in a sense, and so it's a kind of compelled speech. And just to push back a little bit more, play law professor up here, what if the student's collage said, "This disrespects the flag," to cut it up, or the student embedded the swatch into a display of a full flag, use that to fill a gap in a flag. So the element of disrespect is not, to me at least, inherent in the hypothetical, but I've given away my own worldview here.
Well, and the two cases that he suggested were based on religious exercise, which I don't know every religion in the country, but I don't believe that disrespect for a flag is actually a violation of religious beliefs. Perhaps it is, I don't know. But they're not really the same thing. No, the comment is that free speech is and freedom of religion, both actually, are ensconced in the First Amendment. And this sounds more like a free speech issue than it does a freedom of religion issue, at least to me.
So another piece of this, when Barbara and I were preparing, we were pointing out, or we were discussing, that the pressures of the media sometimes force institutions into certain kinds of decisions. If the newspaper had not been editorializing about this, would the college take a different path? And so it's useful to imagine, do a thought experiment of, without the public outcry, what would we want to be doing? And then with the public outcry, do we change our course of action at all, or do we work with the newspaper to say, you are a marketplace of ideas in journalism, we are a marketplace of ideas in knowledge and the arts, so lighten up a little bit, use it as a moment to engage the newspaper with a point of view. You might not succeed there, but there is some commonality between the press and the academy.
Shall we move on to the second one? Okay. For those of you who teach online, as I do on occasion, sometimes we come across students who are not as polite as we would like them to be. I don't know about those of you who do online teaching. I have it's called netiquette, a list of behaviors that I expect the students to comply with. I don't think it represses their speech. It just suggests ways to suggest their ideas that are a little less inflammatory.
So we have Pat, who is complaining about fellow students, and then, oh, I'm sorry, I'll change the slide, forgive me, thank you. Pat's complaining about fellow students, do your reading, stop whining, pull up your socks, and then complaining about the professor also. Needs a good clonk on the noggin here. Now, one might say that penalizing Pat for these online postings doesn't really suppress speech, but it really does. So with respect to point C, consider this to be a free speech kind of issue, even though it just seems like, what, do I put a 0 down in my grade book for this portion of the course? It feels real to Pat, and it feels real to the professor, so take it as a serious inquiry. So you're the dean, the professor comes to you, tells this story. What would your advice be to the professor? Oh, that's the videographer standing up over there. I thought we had a comment. Yes.
I would ask a question about, are there any policies related to Connecticut, in which case that would come into play, and then I would ask the professor about, let's talk about the punishment phase.
So the
So I don't know, 0 out of 20 points is equivalent to 20% degree, or it's 20 points out of 500, but thinking about how much of a penalty there should be for inappropriate. I would agree that the posts are inappropriate, but I might say if we don't have a university wide policy, or you don't have a course policy yourselves, you may not be able to do something about it. It's a teachable moment.
So the comment here is there a netiquette set of rules applicable to the class? What are the professors, what's the professor's evaluation of this situation? The commenter feels that the postings were inappropriate. How do we make the punishment fit the crime? I think Gilbert and Sullivan spoke to that in the Mikado. Let the punishment fit the crime. Would anybody send this student to a behavioral intervention or threat assessment team? Wants to conk the professor over the noggin? We have one hand up. Is that a tentative yes there? Yes.
Well, the way I see it is, this kind of, this person that we're calling a student is well known in the internet. Students actually use the history of the internet, and they were called, they are called for emergency control. They come in, they inflame, the comments are, I have a quarter star, no one can go on. What does that actually contribute to the class? These people cannot come in to contribute to the class. Some people actually will contribute, and maybe the way they're doing it with the active essay, that there is a contribution to discussion. I don't see anything in there that's actually contributing to discussion. And it would seem to me that even using the rules of conduct for the person who is in class, but in class, no student would actually be allowed to participate in a classroom with peers, professors, and also students with that kind of response. Because it's knowledge in internet language is called knowledge, and for a college student it would be imprudent and childish, and definitely you're not contributing. So why would you want to?
Yes, thank you. The comment is in very brief form. These do not advance the substance of the course. In a face-to-face class, the comments would not be appropriate, and therefore they're equally inappropriate in an online context. I think there might be professors who, in their hearts, would like to say to a class of students, pull up your socks, do the reading, and stop whining. And so there is that. There may be some truth behind Pat's comments. Barbara read the hypothetical as involving a female student. I think a male student in a women's studies class sometimes gives different impressions to people.
That's true. Well, I was just thinking about changing. Sometimes it's useful to change the context when you're thinking about a problem like this. And this is my 32nd year of teaching. For the first, 27 years, I just did, face-to-face stuff. And if I had a student who behaved like this in class, I would take the student aside and say, stop it. This is not appropriate behavior. If you continue to behave this way, your grade is going to suffer, or you may, in fact, face discipline. And I've never had a problem after that, after I've spoken to a student like that. I think that punishing the student by giving 0 points is excessively harsh, but that's just my personal opinion.
We have a comment. We have a comment here.
On the tangent you started in terms of behavioral modification, behavioral counseling, it's artfully worded because if it said the professor really could use to have bleach poured in her trunk of her car, or it said she should be pushed down a flight of stairs, there's nothing whimsical about that. But there is something whimsical about saying a good swat on the old Dino, which is a judgment issue that's implicated by the fact that it's done almost humorously. Also, those are the kinds of comments you routinely see on RateForProfessor.com. And so this sort of behavior is out there. But the point is that learning community is supposed to be a closed discussion when you go online. And the comments have greater force when they're directed to a small group than broadcast to the outside world. But there is some ambiguity in the question, and the question really has to do with how you apply judgment, good pedagogical judgment, rather than rights and obligations.
And this comment points out that the implicit threat is couched here in a whimsical way rather than a more aggressive way. And so that one must factor that into the evaluation. And also that in a closed group, in a small group, harsh language can have a more significant impact than similar language that might be publicized to the whole world, that it doesn't feel as immediate to each individual. So we have a comment here about some reluctance to referring the student to outside resources, and we're just out of time. But before we close, at the end of our paper, we have a series of suggestions, and so Barbara, could you walk us quickly through those?
Well, it's going to have to be very quick. Basically, we're suggesting that you look to see if the speaker is targeting an individual or a group, a small group, or a wider audience, and that might change the way you respond to that. Secondly, is the topic a matter of public concern, even if the person is at a private college? And if this had been a non-academic forum where the speech occurred, would the reaction have been different? Third, the Rodriguez case, is the speech amenable to more speech? Can we counteract the hateful speech by using this as a teachable moment so that the whole community can be involved in the discussion? Did the provocative speech violate professional norms? As we talked about earlier, that may make it more amenable to regulation. Did the speaker also engage in conduct? That's really an issue here. Was there a threat to the professor, or was their conduct engaged in that was dangerous or unprofessional? Sixth, would the effect of the provocative speech be minimized or eliminated if you ignore it? Sometimes ignoring it may be the right answer. Seventh, was there a direct threat, and how realistic is that? And eighth, is this an issue of compelled speech? Are you requiring the student or the faculty member to speak against his or her wishes? And if so, what's the institution's rationale for doing that? And is there some way that you can reach the same goal without compelling a student or a faculty member to engage in a particular speech? This is a tough issue. I think we may have raised more questions than answers, but we appreciate your comments and your ideas, and we'll be around for a bit if you want to chat. Thank you.